How many broken bodies would I have to stitch back together before the alphas finally destroyed each other for good? It was the question I asked myself every time the scent of blood and pack politics bled through my clinic door. I just never expected the next body to be his. Chapter 1. The Scent of War. The antiseptic tang in the air was sharp, a sterile scent that clung to the clinic's wooden walls but never quite covered the faint, coppery ghost of old blood. Lyra dipped a fresh cloth into a bowl of steaming water, the heat a dull comfort against her chilled fingers. It was a repetitive motion, a practiced calm she wrapped around herself like a shield against the question that always echoed in the quiet moments. How many broken bodies would she have to stitch back together before the alphas finally destroyed each other for good? Outside, the wind howled through Haven's Edge, carrying with it the smell of pine, wet earth, and something else. Something feral that promised another long night of mending flesh torn apart by pride. She hated that smell. It was the perfume of power, the stench of politics, the very essence of the pack system that had left her hollowed out. Consequently, she worked with a grim efficiency that left no room for feeling. Cleanse the wound, stitch the skin, bind the limb. She did it all because the alternative, letting a wolf suffer, was a line even her cynicism wouldn't let her cross. The tools on her metal tray gleamed under the low light of the oil lamp, her only companions in the encroaching twilight. They were cold, precise, and uncomplicated. Everything pack life was not. A sudden, frantic scratching at the door made her stiffen, her hand hovering over a pair of forceps. It wasn't the heavy pound of a warrior dragging his wounded comrade, but something lighter, more desperate. She cracked the door open, a sliver of cold air rushing in to meet the sterile warmth. Old Lyra stood there, a tattered shawl pulled tight around her hunched shoulders, her face a roadmap of worry. "Lyra, child," she rasped, her breath pluming in the evening chill. "You heard the news?" Lyra's expression remained flat, an unmovable mask she had perfected over years of self-preservation. "I hear the wind, Lyra, and the wolves howling for blood. It's the same news as yesterday." "No, this is different." The old Omega shuffled inside, her eyes wide as she wrung her wrinkled hands. "It's Kael. They say his pack is just beyond the ridge now, hunting Ronan's scouts. He's not just fighting anymore, dear. They say he's erasing them." Lyra's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, a sound that grated on Lyra's nerves because whispers were just the start of trouble. Big trouble always followed. "He doesn't leave survivors, not even the wounded. They're saying he's more beast than man, cursed by the moon itself." Lyra scoffed, turning back to her neatly organized shelves of herbs and bandages. The air filled with the scent of dried lavender and chamomile, a futile attempt to chase away the encroaching violence. "They're all beasts, Lyra. Some are just better at hiding it behind pretty words. A curse is just an excuse for cruelty." She measured out a dose of willow bark into a small pouch, her movements economical. "Why are you really here? You're trembling." Following that direct question, the old woman's facade of gossip bringer crumbled, revealing the raw fear beneath. "A boy from the lower village saw his warriors. Said they move like shadows, with eyes of old gold. They don't make a sound." She took a shaky step closer, her gaze darting towards the flimsy door as if expecting it to splinter inward. "This war feels different, Lyra. It feels like an ending. Ronan is a brute, but Kael is a reckoning. He won't stop at the border." That thought sent a genuine chill through Lyra, colder than any winter wind. She wanted nothing to do with alphas, with their wars, with their foolish codes of honor that only ever ended in bloodshed. She had built this quiet, lonely life for herself precisely to escape that world. Yet, the conflict she had so carefully ignored was now creeping over the horizon, a storm poised to break upon her little sanctuary. Lyra pressed something small and wooden into her hand. It was a crudely carved charm of a sleeping wolf. "For protection," the old woman whispered, her touch as dry as autumn leaves. Before Lyra could refuse the token, Alara was gone, melting back into the growing darkness, leaving only the scent of fear and the weight of a war she could no longer pretend wasn't coming for her. Chapter 2. Scars and Echoes. The old Omega's warning lingered in the air long after she'd vanished, a foul taste in the back of Lyra's throat. Protection. The word was a cruel joke. She dropped the wooden charm onto the table as if it were hot, the clatter loud in the sudden, oppressive silence of the clinic. What good was a piece of wood against an alpha's will? What good was anything? The sharp, metallic clang of the charm hitting the tray was a key turning in a lock she kept buried deep inside. It was a sound too much like the stunned quiet of 100 wolves holding their breath, a silence that had stretched for 1, 2, 3 heartbeats before her world had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The memory came unbidden, a ghost slipping through the cracks in her resolve. It wasn't a full picture, never a full picture. Her mind protected her from that, at least. Instead, it was a collage of sensation, a storm of phantom feelings. The oppressive weight of 100 pairs of eyes, the scent of ozone and triumph from the alpha who stood before her, the one who was supposed to be her destiny, and the sound of his voice, not a shout, but a calm, cutting whisper that had flayed the soul from her bones. Unworthy. The word echoed not in her ears, but in the marrow of her being, a permanent frost she could never thaw. It was a humiliation served cold, a public execution of her spirit from which she'd never recovered. That was what the moon's gift of a fated mate had given her, not a soulmate, but a soul-deep scar. A violent crash from outside ripped her from the past. A heavy thud shook the very foundations of the clinic, followed by the sound of splintering wood and a low, guttural snarl that was pure animal rage. The fight Alara had warned of wasn't on some distant ridge anymore. It was here. Now. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She flattened herself against the wall, away from the single, grimy window, her breath catching in her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, to be small, to be invisible. This was not her battle, this was alpha business, and she was done with alphas. Done with their violence, done with their pride, done with the casual way they broke things, and people. Then came another sound, sharper and more chilling than the snarls. A pained yelp, cut short. Silence descended again, but this was a different kind. Heavy, final, the kind of quiet that follows a death blow. Lyra squeezed her eyes shut, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the wooden counter. Don't look. Don't listen. It has nothing to do with you. She repeated the words like a prayer, a desperate mantra against the part of her that was still a healer, the part that couldn't ignore suffering. Slowly, cautiously, she crept towards the window, her bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. Just a peek, just enough to know the danger had passed. The muddy laneway beside her clinic was a mess of churned earth and debris from a shattered cart. 2 wolves were retreating into the shadows of the forest, their movements sleek and unified. But it was the one they left behind that held her gaze. A large, dark-furred wolf lay motionless on the ground. She couldn't see the fatal wound from here, but she didn't need to. The stillness told the whole story. As she watched, a flicker of movement from the edge of the woods caught her eye. It was one of the victors pausing to look back, and in the dim moonlight she saw the distinct shimmer of silver-tipped fur on its flank. Alara's words echoed in her mind. They move like shadows. It was Kael's pack. The reckoning had arrived, and it was leaving bodies right outside her door. Chapter 3. The Eye of the Storm. An unnerving quiet settled over Haven's Edge in the wake of the fight, a stillness that felt more dangerous than the violence itself. Lyra had retreated from the window, the image of the silver-tipped wolf burned into her mind. She spent the next hour forcing herself through her nightly routine, cleaning instruments that were already spotless, sweeping floors that didn't need it, organizing herbs that were already in perfect order. It was a lie of normalcy, a desperate attempt to pretend the world outside hadn't just tilted on its axis. but the scent of fresh blood was a stubborn ghost in the air now, a violation of her sanctuary. The war wasn't a distant rumor anymore. It had a face. It had a casualty list. It was as she was about to shutter the window for the night that she saw him. Not a shadow this time, but a solid, terrifying presence. He stood across the muddy track, a stone's throw from where the dead wolf lay. He wasn't looking at the body. He was looking at his warriors, who were emerging from the tree line to meet him. And Lyra knew, with a certainty that stole the breath from her lungs, that it was Kael. He was bigger than the stories described, a monolith of raw power and brutal authority. Mud and blood caked his leather armor, but he wore the grime like a second skin, completely untouched by the carnage around him. He moved with a predatory stillness, an absolute economy of motion that spoke of lethal confidence. He was the eye of the storm, the calm center around which all this chaos revolved. Then, as if he could feel her gaze on him, he turned his head. His eyes found hers across the distance and the world fell away. It wasn't a glance. It was an impact. A physical jolt, sharp and electric, shot through her, making her gasp. His eyes weren't just gold. They were the color of ancient amber, molten and intelligent, filled with a power that seemed to strip her bare right where she stood. For one terrifying heartbeat, she felt seen. Not just her physical form, but the jagged, broken thing she kept hidden inside. The connection was immediate, invasive, and utterly unwelcome. It was a spark of something she had sworn she would never feel again, a phantom echo of the mate bond. No. The word was a silent scream in her mind. Not him, not anyone. Never again. She ripped her gaze away, stumbling back from the window as if burned. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, panicked rhythm of pure terror. Why? Why would her soul, the traitorous, foolish thing, respond to him? An alpha, a killer, a monster who represented everything that had destroyed her. It made no sense. It was a cruel trick of the moon, a cosmic joke at her expense. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, trying to erase the image of him, the feel of his stare boring into her very being. This changed nothing. He was a patient she would never treat, a wolf she would never acknowledge. She was safe in her clinic. He was out there. The distance between them was her shield. Summoning every ounce of her resolve, she forced herself to take one last look, needing to see him gone, to confirm that the moment had passed and was meaningless. He was still there, but he was turning away now, dismissing his warriors with a curt nod. It was then that she saw it. As he shifted his weight, the moonlight caught the dark, wet stain spreading across his side. A deep, ragged gash that wept blood down his leg. Her healer's eyes assessed it instantly. Too deep. Badly placed. He was bleeding too much. He was hiding it with an iron will, but the truth was undeniable. The great, untouchable Alpha Kael was dying. And as he took a faltering step into the shadows, a cold dread washed over her, because she knew with a sickening certainty where a wolf that determined to live would go when he was on the verge of death. He was coming for her. Chapter 4. A monster at the door. The world outside her window had dissolved into a mess of churning mud and slashing rain. Lyra stood frozen, her hand still pressed against the glass, the cold of it seeping into her skin. He was dying. She had seen it, and she knew with the gut-deep certainty of a healer that he was coming for her. Every rational thought screamed at her to bolt the door, to barricade the windows, to pretend she was just another empty shack on the edge of a forgotten town. This was Kael, the butcher of the northern ridges, the alpha whose name was a curse. He was the embodiment of the power that had crushed her. Helping him wasn't just a risk. It was a betrayal of the life she had painstakingly built from the ashes of her old one. Her sanctuary was all she had left. And then it came. Not a knock, not a plea for help. Just a dead, heavy thud against the door, the sound of a mountain giving up and falling to the earth. Silence followed. It was a weighted quiet, filled with the drumming of the rain and the frantic, rabbit-quick beat of her own heart. He was there. The monster was at her door, and he was too weak to even ask for entry. What was she supposed to do? What does a person do when their greatest fear shows up broken and bleeding? The healer in her, the part she could never quite kill, was a screaming voice in her head. Oathkeeper, you cannot let him die. But the scarred, terrified Omega cowering beneath it had a louder, more desperate plea. Survivor, don't let him in. He will be your end. Her feet carried her forward before she'd made a conscious choice. Her hand, trembling, reached for the iron bolt. It felt impossibly heavy. She drew it back. The door swung inward with a low groan, revealing the Alpha collapsed on her threshold. Kael was a heap of wet leather and blood-soaked fur, his massive frame folded in on itself. His face was turned away, but one arm was flung out as if reaching for something he couldn't grasp. The rain plastered his dark hair to his skull, and the wound in his side, dear gods, it was worse than she thought, pulsed a sluggish, dark river into the mud. He was so still, too still for a creature so defined by violence and motion. There was no more debate. There was only the rain, the blood, and the dying man who was somehow her responsibility. You stupid, arrogant beast, she muttered, the words a mix of fury and resignation. Gritting her teeth, she hooked her arms under his, the muscles in her back screaming in protest as she dragged his dead weight across the threshold. He was impossibly heavy, a solid mass of muscle and bone. Just as she hauled him fully inside, his skin brushed against hers, a brief, incidental contact. A jolt, white-hot and blinding, shot up her arm. It wasn't a spark. It was a brand. A searing, possessive heat that stamped a single, horrifying word onto her soul. Mine. She cried out, dropping him with a thud. Stumbling back, she stared at her hand, then at him. Her heart filled with a fresh, more potent terror. It was real. The bond she'd thought was a lie, a one-in-a-million failure, was real. And it had just connected her to him. Chapter 5. The Unwanted Claim. Following the shock of that connection, a cold, clinical rage settled over Lyra. It was a familiar defense, a wall of ice she built around her heart. The bond didn't matter. His identity didn't matter. He was just a body, a wound, a problem to be solved and then removed. For hours, she worked under the flickering lamplight, the storm outside a pale imitation of the one raging inside her. She cut away his ruined armor, her hands objective and detached. She cleaned the gash with practiced, efficient movements, her mind focused solely on the torn muscle, the nicked flesh, the steady, alarming flow of blood. She worked because the intricate task of stitching him back together was the only thing that kept her from shattering apart. It was a lie of control, but it was the only thing she had. She had just finished binding the wound with a thick poultice of comfrey and yarrow when his eyes snapped open. There was no grogginess, no disorientation. One moment he was unconscious, the next he was awake, his gaze instantly finding her across the small room. Those amber eyes, no longer hazy with pain, were sharp and terrifyingly alert. They pinned her in place, stripping away her healer's detachment, leaving her feeling exposed and raw. A low groan rumbled in his chest as he tried to sit up, his hand immediately going to his bandaged side. "Don't," she said, her voice coming out sharper than she intended. "You move, and you'll tear every stitch. Then you can bleed to death on your own time." He ignored her, his gaze sweeping the clinic before landing back on her with an unnerving intensity. He inhaled deeply, a pained but deliberate action. His expression shifted. The raw focus softened into something else, something that made the hair on her arms stand on end. Disbelief, awe, and a terrifying certainty. "That scent," he rasped, his voice a gravelly whisper. "It's you." Lyra froze, a leaden weight settling in her stomach. "I don't know what you're talking about. You're delirious from blood loss." She took a step back, needing distance. The room felt like it was shrinking, the air growing thick and heavy. "No." He shook his head, a small, pained movement. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his eyes never leaving her face. The power in them was undiminished, a smoldering fire that reached across the room and held her captive. Then he said the word, the single, devastating word that had ruined her life once before. Mate. The word hit her like a physical blow. All the air rushed from her lungs. The icy wall around her heart didn't just crack, it exploded. No, she whispered, the denial a fragile, broken thing. You're wrong. The bond, he breathed, a slow, wondering smile touching his lips. It was a startling sight on his harsh face. I never thought. He looked at her as if she were a miracle, a drink of water after a lifetime of thirst. And that look, that hopeful, possessive look, was the cruelest thing he could have done. It was the same look she had received years ago, just before it had twisted into contempt. I said no. The words ripped from her throat, laced with a panic so profound it was almost a scream. I am not your mate. The moon makes mistakes. I am living proof of it. She backed away until she hit the far wall, her hands splayed against the rough wood. She needed him to understand, to see the revulsion in her eyes and believe it, because if he didn't, she was in more danger than she could possibly imagine. You are a stranger, an alpha, a killer. You are nothing to me. His smile faded, replaced by a look of hardened resolve. The pain in his side was forgotten. His entire being focused on her with an intensity that promised he would not be denied. He didn't have the strength to stand, but his voice was pure alpha command. You can lie to yourself. You can even lie to me. He paused, his golden eyes burning into hers. But you cannot lie to our bond. You are mine, and I am not letting you go. Chapter 6. A Choice in Blood. The standoff in the clinic was a silent, suffocating war. Kael was too weak to move from the cot, and Lyra was too trapped by the storm of her own terror to flee. His declaration hung in the air between them, a promise that felt more like a cage. For hours, she watched him from the far side of the room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Sleep was an impossibility. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his, molten gold and filled with a certainty she couldn't bear. He was an alpha, and alphas took what they wanted. The fact that he was currently helpless was a temporary state of grace, and she knew it. The real question wasn't if he would try to claim her, but when. The decision was stolen from her hands just before dawn. It started with a sound from outside, a twig snapping, too deliberate for a random forest creature. Then another. Kael was instantly awake, his head lifting from the cot, a low warning growl vibrating in his chest. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw not possessiveness, but a shared primal understanding of immediate danger. They were being hunted. Before either of them could react, the clinic door exploded inward, ripped from its hinges in a shower of splintered wood. Two wolves burst into the room, their forms massive and menacing in the dim light. They were not from Kael's pack. Their scent was wrong, acrid and hostile. Ronin's scouts. They were here to finish the job. Well, well, the leader sneered, his eyes, small and cruel, fixing on Kael's prone form. Look what the little healer dragged in. Thought you could hide from us, Kael? He took a predatory step into the room, his claws extending with a soft click on the floorboards. His gaze flickered to Lyra, dismissing her as nothing more than an insect. Unlucky for you, girlie. No witnesses. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Lyra. This was it. This was how she died. In a rundown clinic, caught in the crossfire of a war between monsters. She could run. The back door was only a few feet away. She could slip out, vanish into the woods, and leave Kael to his fate. It was the smart thing to do, the sane thing. It was survival. But as the scout lunged toward the cot, something inside her snapped. It was the healer's oath. It was the memory of the bond, that unwanted spark of connection. It was a sudden, violent refusal to be a victim again. She would not let these brutes destroy her home and murder a helpless man in front of her. While the first scout was focused on Kael, Lyra moved. She didn't grab a weapon. She grabbed what she knew. With a desperate cry, she swept an entire shelf of glass jars to the floor. Tinctures, oils, and dried herbs crashed down in a chaotic mess. A bottle of highly flammable rubbing alcohol shattered, its contents splashing near the lit oil lamp. The second scout turned toward her, his lips peeling back in a snarl, but it was too late. With a roar, the spilled oil ignited. A wall of smoke and hungry orange flame erupted between them, separating her and Kael from their attackers. Chaos. The scouts roared in fury and surprise, backing away from the heat. Smoke filled the small cabin, stinging Lyra's eyes and choking her lungs. "Come on!" she yelled, grabbing Kael's arm and hauling him off the cot. He was barely conscious, a dead weight against her, but adrenaline gave her strength. "You have to move!" Together, they stumbled towards the back door, the crackle of the fire and the enraged howls of the scouts pursuing them. They burst out into the pre-dawn chill, collapsing into the wet ferns at the edge of the forest as the roof of her clinic, her sanctuary, began to catch fire. Kael coughed, leaning heavily against her, his body trembling with weakness. He looked from the burning building back to her, his amber eyes glowing with a fierce raw emotion in the firelight. "You," he rasped, his voice thick with smoke and something else. "Awe. You are mine." Lyra stared at the flames devouring her life, her home, her peace. Everything was gone, all because of him. She shoved him away, her breath coming in ragged, angry sobs. "I saved your life," she snarled, her voice shaking with adrenaline and rage. "But I will never, ever belong to an alpha again." Chapter 7. A Fragile Truce. The forest swallowed them whole. Behind them, the orange glow of Lyra's burning clinic was a hateful smear against the bruised purple of the dawn sky. Every ragged breath she took was filled with the scent of pine and wet ash, a constant reminder of everything she had just lost. Kael leaned against a tree, his face pale and strained in the dim light, his hand pressed to his wounded side. His declaration and her furious denial still hung in the frigid air between them, a silent, crackling energy. He was too weak to press his claim, and she was too exhausted to run any farther. So they existed in this fragile, unspoken truce, bound together by the enemies at their backs and the smoking ruin of her life. Just as the first rays of sun pierced the canopy, they arrived. 3 wolves, moving with a silent, coordinated grace that was unnervingly beautiful. They weren't Ronan's scouts. These were Kael's. They materialized from the shadows, their forms immense and powerful, their eyes fixed on their injured alpha. The leader, a wolf with a scarred muzzle and intelligent gray eyes, stepped forward and dipped his head. "Alpha." His voice was a low, respectful rumble. "We thought we'd lost you." He glanced at Lyra, his gaze lingering for a moment, sharp and assessing. There was no warmth in it, only suspicion. "Yorick," Kael acknowledged, his voice strained. "Ronan's men, the healer's clinic." "We saw the smoke," Yorick confirmed, his expression grim. He looked at Lyra again. "And the healer?" "She is with me," Kael stated, the words simple but carrying an undeniable weight of possession that made Lyra's skin crawl. It was a declaration to his pack. "She is under my protection. She is off limits." Lyra had no choice. Her home was gone, her supplies were ash, and Ronan's wolves were likely hunting for the witness who got away. To be alone in these woods was a death sentence. Accepting the protection of the man who had inadvertently destroyed her life was a bitter, necessary pill to swallow. She hated the irony, hated her own helplessness, but most of all, she hated the flicker of relief she felt when Kael's warriors positioned themselves around her, forming a subtle, protective circle. For the next 2 days, they traveled. It was a blur of exhaustion and simmering tension. Kael, still recovering, would sometimes stumble on the uneven terrain. The first time it happened, she reached out instinctively to steady him, her hand landing on his arm. The jolt was instant, a familiar, unwelcome fire that shot up her arm and straight to her core. She snatched her hand back as if burned, her cheeks flushing with anger. After that, she was careful to keep her distance, a feat that was nearly impossible in the tight confines of their nightly camps. She would sit across the fire, watching him, her thoughts a tangled mess of resentment and a strange, unwilling curiosity. He wasn't what she expected. He spoke little, but when he did, his commands were quiet and precise. He ensured she ate before he did, a gesture of respect she hadn't received even in her old pack. He never pushed, never pressed his claim, never even met her gaze for more than a fleeting second. It was a quiet deference that was utterly at odds with the ruthless killer from the stories. This unexpected gentleness was more dangerous to her resolve than any show of force would have been. Chapter 8. The Strength of Scars. After days of relentless travel, they made a more permanent camp in a hidden caldera, a natural fortress of rock and ancient pines. Kael was healing quickly, the supernatural vitality of an alpha knitting his torn flesh back together. With his returning strength, the tense peace between them began to fray at the edges. He was a constant, powerful presence she could feel in her bones, a low hum of energy that set her teeth on edge. Lyra, on the other hand, was an anomaly, an outsider. The pack warriors treated her with a wary distance, their gazes a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. She was the strange Omega who had saved their alpha, the stray who smelled of herbs and defiance. She wasn't one of them, and they made sure she felt it with every shared meal and every silent appraisal. The simmering hostility finally boiled over one afternoon. A bulky, brutish warrior named Fen cornered her near the stream where she was washing bandages. He was one of Ronan's pack, turned coat when Kael had conquered their territory, a wolf who only understood dominance. "Little healer," he sneered, blocking her path. His smile was all teeth. "You have our alpha fooled. He looks at you and sees something special. I look at you, and I see a weakness." Lyra continued to wring out a cloth, her movements deliberate, refusing to meet his gaze. "Then I suggest you get your eyes checked." Fen's smile vanished. He took a step closer, crowding her, his sheer size an act of intimidation. "Omegas have a place, on their backs or at their looms, not whispering poison in an alpha's ear. You don't belong here." He reached out, his hand clamping down on her shoulder, his grip a crushing weight meant to bruise, to remind her of her fragility. "Maybe you need a reminder of where you stand." That was his mistake. He expected her to cower, to tremble. He expected the broken Omega everyone saw. But he didn't know that Lyra had learned to fight in a different way. She didn't fight with muscle. She fought with knowledge. As his fingers dug into her, she didn't try to pull away. Instead, she dropped the cloth and moved in, her own hand shooting up to strike the side of his neck with the heel of her palm. Not a punch, but a single, precise jab. She hit the nerve cluster just below his ear. A jolt of electric pain shot through him. His entire arm went numb, his grip vanishing instantly. He staggered back, his eyes wide with shock and agony, a look of utter disbelief on his face. He'd been disabled by a single, perfectly placed touch. "I belong," Lyra said, her voice low and shaking with a cold fury she hadn't felt in years. "Exactly where I choose to stand." A sharp, commanding voice cut through the tension. "Fen!" Kael stood at the edge of the clearing, his golden eyes blazing. He had seen the end of it. He had seen her strike. He had seen her refuse to be a victim. He strode forward, his presence a wave of absolute authority that made Fen shrink back, cradling his limp arm. Kael didn't even look at his warrior. His gaze was fixed on Lyra, and in his eyes, she saw something that shook her to her core. It wasn't just surprise. It was a raw, unconcealed admiration that was more intimate than any touch. He had seen past her scars to the strength beneath, and that look was a brand new kind of threat. Chapter 9. A Collision of Fates. The incident with Fen shifted something in the pack's dynamic. The whispers didn't stop, but now they were tinged with a grudging respect instead of just suspicion. Lyra had proven she wasn't a fragile doll, and in a warrior pack, strength was a language everyone understood. The change made her feel even more unsettled, because it was Kael's reaction that truly haunted her. That look of admiration was a crack in her armor, a silent acknowledgement that threatened to breach walls she'd spent years building. To escape it, she threw herself into her work, foraging for herbs and tending to the pack's minor injuries, creating a bubble of familiar purpose in a world that was anything but. They were on the move again a few days later, traveling through a narrow, rocky pass when the world exploded into chaos. It was a perfectly executed ambush. Arrows rained down from the cliffs above, their sharpened points glinting in the midday sun. Ronan's wolves swarmed from the shadows, a wave of desperate, snarling fury. The clearing became a whirlwind of motion and sound. The clang of steel, the sickening thud of bodies colliding, the guttural roars of wolves fighting for their lives. Lyra was instantly shoved behind a line of warriors, her heart pounding against her ribs. She was a non-combatant, a liability, and all she could do was stay down and pray. From her position behind a large boulder, she watched Kael. He was magnificent and terrifying, a blur of deadly grace in the heart of the battle. He moved like the reckoning Alara had described, his twin blades a silver arc of death. But there were too many. For every one of Ronan's wolves he cut down, 2 more seemed to take their place. She saw an attacker go down on Kael's left, and he turned to meet another charging from his right. In that split second of movement, she saw it. A flash of light from the cliffs above. An archer, taking careful aim at Kael's exposed back. There was no time to shout a warning, no time for anyone else to react. Thought ceased to exist. There was only a raw, primal instinct she didn't know she possessed. She launched herself from behind the rock. Kael! The name was ripped from her throat as she sprinted across the dangerous space separating them. She threw her entire body into his, a desperate, clumsy shove. The impact was jarring. Her shoulder crashed into the hard muscle of his back just as he turned. An arrow hissed through the air where his heart had been a second before, embedding itself in the trunk of a pine tree with a vicious thwack. He stumbled, his arms coming around her instinctively to break their fall. They went down in a tangle of limbs, her soft body crashing against his hard one. And the world dissolved into pure sensation, skin against skin, breath against breath. The mate bond, which had been a simmering ember for days, erupted into a raging inferno. It was a tidal wave of heat, of power, of raw emotion that flooded every inch of her. She felt his shock, his relief, his fierce, possessive triumph. She felt her own terror, her own reluctant courage, and a dizzying, horrifying sense of coming home. It was too much. It was overwhelming. It was everything she had been running from. The moment the immediate threat passed, she scrambled away from him, her hands shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The intimacy of that brief, explosive connection was 1,000 times more terrifying than the arrow had been. She got to her feet and fled, not caring about the ongoing battle, needing only to escape the suffocating intensity of him. She found cover behind another cluster of rocks, her back pressed against the cold stone, and waited for her world to stop spinning. After a few eternal moments, she dared to peek out. The fighting was dying down. And Kael was standing, his gaze fixed on her hiding spot. He took a half step in her direction, and her heart seized. But then he stopped. He looked at her, his golden eyes filled with a turbulent, unreadable emotion, and he made a choice. He turned back to the fight, giving her the space she had so desperately sought. That single act of restraint, of letting her go when the bond was screaming for him to claim her, confused her more than anything he had ever done. Chapter 10. The Poisoned King. The aftermath of the ambush was a grim affair. Lyra moved through the camp on autopilot, her healer's instincts taking over as she tended to the wounded. She cleaned gashes, set a broken arm, and handed out herbs for pain, all while meticulously avoiding one particular patient, Kael. She could feel his golden eyes tracking her every move, a silent, weighty presence that she refused to acknowledge. His restraint in the past, his choice to let her run, had been a crack in her certainty. It was easier when he was a monster, a tyrant from the stories. But the quiet, observant man who watched her with something other than possession, he was infinitely more dangerous to the careful peace she had cultivated in her soul. She was organizing her dwindling supply of herbs when she heard it. A deep, ragged cough from the shadows near the edge of the camp. It wasn't a normal sound. It was wet and strained. A desperate, tearing noise that spoke of a deep sickness. She found him leaning against a tree, hidden from the view of his pack. His broad back was to her, his shoulders trembling with the force of the spasm. When the fit passed, he remained hunched over, his breath coming in shallow, painful gasps. A fine sheen of sweat covered his skin despite the cool night air. Her healer's eye caught another detail, a faint, dark tremor in his hand as he braced himself against the tree. "That's not a battle wound," she stated, her voice flat, devoid of the sympathy she would offer any other wolf. He stiffened but didn't turn around. "It is nothing." "Nothing." Lyra stepped closer, her anger a welcome shield against the cold dread seeping into her. "That was a lungful of blood, Kael. I've seen men die from less." She moved around the tree to face him, and the sight of him in the moonlight made her breath catch. The iron control was gone. His face was a mask of agony, his lips tinged with blue, and near the half-healed wound on his side, she could see a faint, spidery web of black veins beneath his skin. It was a telltale sign she had only ever read about in old texts. "It's poison," she whispered, the diagnosis falling from her lips like a stone. "A slow-acting one." He finally met her gaze, his eyes clouded with pain but still blazing with a stubborn pride. "It seems your healing skills are as sharp as the stories say." Fury, hot and swift, surged through her. It was an irrational anger, born of a fear she refused to name, the fear that she was beginning to care. "You're dying," she said, the words a harsh accusation. "You have been this whole time, and you said nothing." He had brought his war to her doorstep, dragged her into his violent world, and all while he was carrying a death sentence inside him. The injustice of it was a bitter pill. "Why?" "Telling you would have changed nothing," he said, his voice a low rasp. He pushed himself away from the tree, straightening with a visible effort that cost him dearly. "My fight with Ronan is my own. The poison is my own. It has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," she countered, taking a step back as he loomed over her. "You made it my problem when you collapsed on my floor." This changed everything. It gave her an escape, an excuse. Getting tangled with an alpha was foolish. Getting tangled with a doomed alpha was a form of self-destruction she couldn't afford. It would be like her past heartbreak, but 1,000 times worse because this time the ending was already written. "I can't," she said, her voice dropping, the anger draining away to leave only a hollow ache. "I won't. I'm done with alphas, and I'm especially done with tragic, lost causes." She turned her back on him, on the scent of sickness and the look of pained resignation in his eyes. She would not let herself feel pity for him. She would not let herself care. It was the only way to survive. Chapter 11. A Ghost from the Past. Lyra was determined to leave. She packed a small satchel with a water skin and the last of her dried rations, her movements stiff and jerky. Every warrior she passed watched her, their faces unreadable, but no one moved to stop her. It was a silent, collective permission. They would not hold the unwilling Omega who had so thoroughly rejected their alpha. She was just about to melt into the forest when a voice, low and steady, stopped her. "Leaving so soon, healer?" It was Yorick, Kael's second-in-command. He stood in her path, his scarred face impassive, but his gray eyes held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. "Your alpha is dying," she stated coldly. "There's nothing I can do for him. There is no reason for me to stay." "You think you know him," Yorick said, his voice quiet, almost conversational. It wasn't a question. You look at him and see a monster, a killer, the same as all the others. He took a step closer. Let me tell you a story. 5 years ago in the Blackwood Pack, a young alpha was meant to perform a public claiming of his fated mate, a young Omega healer. The whole pack was gathered. Lyra froze, the satchel slipping from her numb fingers. The air grew thin, the world around her starting to feel distant and hazy. She knew this story. She had lived it. Yorick continued, his voice a relentless, steady rhythm. The alpha was arrogant, cruel. He got to the altar and he rejected her, said the moon had cursed him with a flawed, unworthy mate. Every word was a hammer blow to the scar on Lyra's soul. He shamed her in front of everyone. But that wasn't the end of it. By their law, a rejected mate was to be marked as an outcast, a ritual of humiliation that would have broken her spirit completely. Lyra squeezed her eyes shut, a strangled sound escaping her lips. She remembered the feeling of 100 pairs of eyes on her, the mix of pity and contempt. She remembered the scent of her mate's triumph as he turned his back on her. "Stop," she whispered. "No," Yorick said, his voice firm. "You need to hear this." Just as the pack elders were about to perform the ritual, a visitor spoke. A visiting alpha from the Northern Territories who was there for a trade negotiation. He didn't shout. He didn't draw a weapon. Yorick's gaze was piercing. He simply stood up and said, "Enough." His voice was quiet, but his power, it silenced the entire valley. The Blackwood Alpha, for all his arrogance, took one look at this stranger and ended the ceremony. The Omega was allowed to leave with what little dignity she had left. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Do you know who that visiting alpha was, healer?" The world tilted. The memory, once a source of pure agony, was now shifting, reforming around a new, impossible truth. She remembered a dark, imposing figure at the edge of the crowd, a silent storm of power whose intervention she had never understood, a ghost who had saved her from something far worse. Her eyes flew open, wide with a horrified, dawning realization. "No." "It was him," Yorick finished, his voice soft. "It was Kael. The foundation of her world didn't crack. It turned to dust, the monster, the killer. The alpha she despised with every fiber of her being had been her silent, unknown protector on the worst day of her life. She turned, her legs moving on their own, and ran. She found Kael by the stream, watching the water, his shoulders slumped in a way that spoke of a deep, profound weariness. He heard her approach and looked up, his face a mask of resignation, expecting her final, cutting goodbye. But words were gone. All the anger, all the fear was washed away by a tidal wave of emotions she couldn't name. Gratitude, guilt, confusion, and a deep, aching pull that would no longer be denied. She didn't slow down. She closed the distance between them and crashed into him, her hands coming up to cup his face. His eyes widened in shock. And then, she kissed him. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a desperate, frantic collision, a raw outpouring of 5 years of pain and a single stunning moment of revelation. It was a question, a confession, and a surrender, all at once. Chapter 12. A Debt of Blood. The kiss was a cataclysm. It shattered the fragile silence between them, a desperate fusion of past and present. For a moment, Kael was frozen in shock, but then a low groan rumbled in his chest and he responded, his mouth slanting over hers with a hunger that was both terrifying and intoxicating. His arms came around her, pulling her flush against his body, and the world dissolved into the raw, undeniable power of the bond. It was a raging fire, a current of pure life that arced between them, and for the first time, Lyra didn't pull away. She leaned into it, her fingers tangling in his hair, letting the overwhelming feeling wash over her. It was a terrifying surrender, a leap into the one fire she had sworn she would never go near again. They broke apart, both breathless and trembling, the air thick with unspoken words. His golden eyes searched hers, filled with a raw, hopeful vulnerability that made her heart ache. Before either of them could speak, a piercing warning cry sliced through the camp. "Scouts! They're back!" Instantly, the fragile intimacy shattered. Kael was on his feet, his body tensing, the Alpha King returning in a surge of protective instinct. But the poison was still in his veins. She saw him sway, his hand going to his side as a wave of pain washed over him. Warriors swarmed to form a defensive line, blades hissing from their sheaths. This wasn't a stealthy ambush like before. This was a brazen, desperate assault. Ronan's wolves burst from the trees, their howls filled with a rabid fury. Lyra scrambled back, trying to find cover, but this time was different. The lead scout, a hulking brute with a matted beard and cruel piggy eyes, saw her. He saw her with Kael. He saw the aftermath of the kiss in their flushed faces and tangled limbs. A malicious grin split his face. "Forget the Alpha!" he roared, pointing a bloody axe directly at her. "He's half dead already. Get the female, take his mate, and we take his heart." The world narrowed to a single point of terror. They were coming for her. She was the target, the pack's weakness. But before the first wolf could reach her, Kael moved. He let out a roar that was not human. It was a sound of pure, primal rage, the sound of a predator whose most sacred thing had been threatened. The poison was forgotten. His weariness vanished. All that remained was a feral, unstoppable fury. He met the charge head-on, his blades a blur of silver, no longer fighting like a king leading his men, but like a beast defending its den. He was a whirlwind of death, a wall of muscle and steel between Lyra and the enemy. He fought with a desperation that was terrifying to behold. He was pushing his poisoned body far beyond its limits, trading his life force for this single explosive burst of strength. He cut down the wolf with the axe, then another who tried to flank him. He was magnificent. He was terrifying, and he was killing himself to protect her. He cleared a space around her, his warriors rushing in to support him, but the cost was devastating. As the last of the attackers was driven back into the forest, Kael's strength finally gave out. His blades clattered to the ground. He staggered, a shudder racking his entire frame, and collapsed to his knees, his head bowed. Lyra rushed to his side, her hands hovering over him, not knowing where to touch. He was convulsing, a violent tremor shaking his muscles as the poison, agitated by the immense exertion, raged through his system. His breath came in ragged, tearing gasps. "Kael!" she cried out, her voice breaking. She caught him as he fell, cradling his head in her lap. His skin was cold and clammy, his life force fading like a guttering candle flame. All the walls, all the denial, all the carefully constructed hatred she had nurtured for years crumbled to dust. There was no more running. There was only the terrifying, undeniable truth. As she held the dying Alpha in her arms, she knew, with a certainty that was as profound as it was painful, that she could not let him die. His fight had become hers. Chapter 13. The Embers of a Vow. The camp was a whirlwind of controlled chaos, but Lyra saw none of it. Her world had shrunk to the space of a rough-spun blanket laid inside a sheltered tent, and the too still form of the Alpha lying upon it. Kael. She worked with a frantic, desperate focus that had nothing to do with her old, detached deficiency. This was personal. This was a frantic race against a poison she didn't understand, and a death she refused to accept. His warriors stood guard outside, a silent, grim-faced honor guard. But inside, there was only the sound of her own ragged breathing, and the shallow, unsteady whisper of his. The air was thick with the scent of blood, sweat, and the strange, metallic tang of the venom in his veins. With a deep breath, she began the painstaking work of saving him. She had to cut away the last of his ruined leather armor, her shears slicing through the tough material. Then came his undershirt, soaked through with blood and sweat. She peeled the damp cloth away, revealing the hard, scarred landscape of his torso. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled as she cleaned the dirt and grime from his skin. This was a different kind of intimacy than their desperate kiss. It was quiet, vulnerable, and stripped of all pretense. He was not a king here. He was not a warrior. He was simply a man, broken and feverish under her care, his life a fragile thing resting in her hands. She traced the network of old scars on his skin, each one a story of a battle fought and won. But the web of black veins near his wound was a story of a battle he was losing. As she worked, applying a poultice of crushed herbs to draw out the fever, her defenses crumbled away one by one. The anger she had clung to felt childish now, the denial a flimsy shield. All that was left was the raw, hollowed-out terror of losing him. What would this world feel like without his intense golden gaze? What would it be like without the low, rumbling timbre of his voice? A cold, empty place. The realization settled over her, quiet and profound. It wasn't about the bond. It wasn't about duty or fate. She, Lyra, the broken Omega who had sworn off all connection, had fallen in love with the one man she should have despised. The admission didn't come with a crash, but with a soft, aching surrender in the quiet of her own heart. A low groan brought her back to the present. His eyes fluttered open, hazy with pain but fixed on her. He saw the look on her face, the fear, the unshed tears, the raw emotion she was no longer hiding. A flicker of something pained crossed his features. "Lyra," he rasped, his voice rough. "You don't have to." He licked his dry lips, his gaze searching hers. "The bond? I will not force it. It is not a cage." He took a shuddering breath, his hand weakly finding hers, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Fate brought you to me, but I will not let it be the reason you stay." He squeezed her hand, his voice dropping to a raw, earnest whisper that pierced her straight through the heart. "I will earn you, or I will die trying. That is my vow." The selfless promise, so at odds with everything she knew about alphas, was a final, devastating blow to the last of her defenses. Chapter 14. The Price of the Bond. Kael's vow echoed in Lyra's mind for the next day, a constant, warming presence. It was a promise of a future she had never dared to imagine. While he rested, she ventured into the surrounding woods, searching for a rare silverleaf moss she knew might help soothe the poison's effects on his nerves. Hope, a fragile and unfamiliar feeling, had taken root in her chest. She was so focused on her task, her eyes scanning the base of ancient oaks, that she didn't sense the other presence until it was too late. A twig snapped behind her. She whirled around, her hand flying to the knife at her belt, but a figure was already stepping out from behind a large boulder, blocking her path back to the camp. It wasn't one of Kael's warriors. It was Ronan. He was a large, brutish alpha, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. He wasn't flanked by warriors. He had come alone, a deliberate act of unarmed intimidation. "The little healer," he drawled, his voice a low, mocking rumble. "So far from your pack. Looking for a cure for your dying king?" "What do you want, Ronan?" Lyra demanded, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. She stood her ground, refusing to show the fear that was coiling in her stomach. "I want what's mine," he sneered. "Kael took my lands, my warriors, but he made one mistake. He found a weakness." His cruel eyes raked over her. He's dying, isn't he? I can smell the rot on him from here. And you little fool, you think you can save him with leaves and prayers." He took a slow, deliberate step closer. "You think your fated bond will be his salvation? Has he told you the price of that bond? Or is he letting you fall in love with a pretty lie?" A cold dread began to seep into Lyra's bones, chilling the newfound warmth in her chest. "I don't know what you're talking about." Ronan laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed through the quiet woods. "Of course you don't. He wouldn't tell you the truth. The poison I gave him isn't just a simple venom healer. It's a curse. The Bloodvine curse. It's designed to wither an alpha's bloodline from the inside out. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. It doesn't just kill the host. It has a secondary feature. Once the mate bond is fully completed, it leeches the life from the alpha's mate, using their vitality to fuel its final destructive push. Completing the bond won't save him. It will kill you, and he will follow moments later. The world stopped. The trees, the ground, the very air seemed to freeze. Kill her? The words didn't make sense. Betrayal, swift and absolute, slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. Kael knew. He had to have known. His vow to earn her? Was it all a monstrous lie? Was he just trying to trick her into completing the bond, hoping it would be a cure, not caring if it cost her life? The fragile hope in her chest shattered, replaced by an icy, familiar agony. Of course, it was always a lie. "He's lying!" A desperate voice roared from the edge of the clearing. Kael was there, leaning heavily on Yorick, his face a mask of fury and panic. He had sensed her danger, felt her terror through the bond, and dragged himself from his sickbed. He looked from Ronan's smirking face to her horrified one. "Lyra, don't listen to him." But she couldn't hear him. All she could see was another alpha making another promise, another fated mate leading her to another slaughter. She stumbled back, away from Ronan, but also away from Kael. Her hands came up to her mouth, a choked sob escaping. Her past and present had collided in a devastating fiery crash. Chapter 15. The Last Act of Mercy. The clearing was a tinderbox of tension. Ronan stood with a triumphant smirk, having thrown his poison-tipped words and watched them land perfectly. Kael, supported by his beta, looked utterly desperate, his golden eyes wide with a frantic plea. He took a staggering step toward her, his hand outstretched. "Lyra," he twists the truth. I would never hurt you." His voice, raw with sincerity, was a distant buzz in her ears. All she could hear was the echo of another alpha's voice 5 years ago, whispering promises that had turned to ash in his mouth. Her worst fear had been realized. She had let her guard down, allowed herself to feel, and it had turned out to be the most elaborate trap of all. Love wasn't her salvation. It was her executioner. Her past trauma, the ghost she had lived with for so long, rose up and consumed everything else. The trust she had started to build, the hope she had dared to feel, it all dissolved into the familiar, bitter certainty of betrayal. "Don't," she whispered, the word a fragile, broken thing. She took another step back, her gaze skittering away from his, unable to bear the agony she saw there. Because what if it wasn't a lie? What if he was just as trapped as she was? It didn't matter. The result was the same. Pain. Death. Destruction. "Don't touch me." "He is lying to you," Kael insisted, his voice cracking with the effort to project strength he no longer had. "The curse. It's real. But I didn't know about the effect on the bond, I swear it. I would have never let you get close if I had." But his words were meaningless now. In her mind, the calculation was simple and brutal. If she stayed, she was damned. The bond would either kill her, as Ronan claimed, or she would be forced to watch the man she now loved wither away into nothing. Either path was a journey into an agony she could not survive a second time. Leaving was the only answer. In a twisted way, it felt like an act of mercy. She would save herself from the curse, and she would save him from the agony of her presence, of a bond that could never be. She was cutting out the infection before it could kill them both. It was the only way. "Goodbye, Kael," she said, her voice hollow, devoid of all emotion. She had to be numb. If she let herself feel anything, she would shatter. She turned her back on him, on the scent of pine and his unique wild musk, on the golden eyes that had seen past her scars. She started walking, each step a physical effort, as if she were wading through thick setting concrete. The mate bond, stretched taut between them, began to scream. It was a silent, tearing pain in her soul, a violent ripping of something essential. "Lyra, please!" His cry was a ragged, desperate sound, the call of a man watching his last hope walk away. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She just kept walking, forcing one foot in front of the other, focusing on the dark, anonymous shadows of the forest ahead. Just as she reached the tree line, she heard a choked gasp, followed by the sickeningly soft sound of a heavy body hitting the forest floor. Her steps faltered. For a single agonizing heartbeat, she stopped. She fought the overwhelming urge to turn around. Don't look back. It's a trap. It will only bring more pain. Clenching her fists until her nails bit into her palms, she forced herself forward, leaving him collapsed and broken in the clearing behind her. She was a ghost again, fading back into the wilderness, her heart a cold, dead weight in her chest. Chapter 16. The Silence of a Name. She couldn't leave. Lyra had tried. She had walked until the trees blurred together and the tearing pain in her soul became a physical agony so profound she collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. The mate bond wasn't a thread she could cut. It was a living part of her, and leaving him was like trying to outrun her own heart. Defeated, she had stumbled back to the camp, a ghost drawn back to her own haunting. She found them in the main tent, the air thick with the scent of blood and despair. Kael lay on a bed of furs, his skin pale and waxy in the lantern light. He was unconscious, his breathing a shallow, rattling whisper. The pack's healers stood by, their faces grim and helpless. There was no cure for a curse this powerful. Lyra became a silent fixture in the corner of the tent, a reluctant vigil keeper. She couldn't bring herself to touch him, couldn't bear the jolt of a bond that was now tainted with lies and death, so she watched. She watched the life slowly, relentlessly seep out of him. His warriors came and went, their faces etched with grief and a barely concealed resentment for her. They knew. Jorik had likely told them of her rejection, of how their alpha's spirit had broken the moment she walked away. She was the poison that had finished the job Ronan's curse had started. She deserved their hatred. She hated herself enough for all of them. Through it all, Kael drifted in a feverish, tormented twilight. He rarely moved, but sometimes he would murmur, his voice a broken, fragile thing. And he only ever said one word. Her name. Lyra. It was a sigh, a question, a plea. He would whisper it into the suffocating quiet of the tent, over and over, as if her name was the only anchor he had left in a world that was fading to black. Each time he said it, it was a fresh stab of guilt in her heart. He was calling for the person who had abandoned him, searching for the mate who had rejected him. She couldn't stand it anymore. After a full day of listening to her name become a dying man's prayer, she moved to his side. The warriors watched her, but no one stopped her. She knelt by the furs and, with a trembling hand, reached out and took his. His skin was cold, his grip non-existent, but the moment she touched him, a flicker of something passed through the bond, a faint, weak echo of the fire that had once been there, and he quieted. The restless murmuring of her name ceased, and for the first time in hours, a flicker of peace seemed to settle over his agonized features. He was still dying. She hadn't changed that. But her presence, even now, was a comfort to him. The realization was a unique and exquisite form of torture. She was his solace and his poison, his mate and his executioner. She held his hand, feeling the thread of his life grow thinner with every passing second, trapped in an impossible limbo between her fear and her heartbreak. Chapter 17. The Cost of Fear. The attack came with the chilling silence of a predator that knows its prey is already down. There was no howl of a war cry, no crashing through the undergrowth. Ronan simply appeared at the entrance of the tent, flanked by two of his largest guards, their blades already drawn and dripping with the blood of the sentries they had silently dispatched. Jorik and the other warriors inside scrambled for their weapons, but Ronan's focus was absolute. He strode past them as if they were nothing more than furniture, his eyes fixed on the pathetic dying form of his rival on the bed of furs. His smile was a venomous slash across his face. Well now, Ronan said, his voice dripping with triumphant cruelty. He nudged Kael's shoulder with the toe of his boot. The great Alpha Kael, brought low by a few drops of poison and a fickle omega. A rather pathetic end to a legendary reign, wouldn't you say? He looked directly at Lyra, his eyes glinting with malice. I came to finish the job, but this is a far sweeter victory, watching you both suffer. Lyra stared at him, the blood frozen in her veins. This was it, the final cowardly blow. Jorek moved to intercept, but Ronan's guards were brutally efficient, engaging him in a desperate, close-quarters fight. All of her choices, all of her fears, had led to this single, helpless moment. She had run from the bond, terrified it would kill her. She had pushed Kael away, terrified he was lying. She had let Ronan's words poison her just as surely as his curse had poisoned Kael. And now, she was going to watch the man she loved be slaughtered in front of her. It was in that moment, with Ronan raising his blood-stained sword over Kael's still form, that the truth hit Lyra with the force of a physical blow. Her greatest fear had never been the bond, or the curse, or even death. Her greatest fear was this exact moment, losing him. And her own terror, her own inability to trust, had delivered him right to his executioner. She had been so afraid of the pain love might cause that she had thrown away the love itself, wasting precious, irreplaceable time they could have had. She had let her past wound dictate her future, and in doing so, she had authored this tragic, bloody end. The cost of her fear was not some potential far-off heartbreak. It was here. It was now. It was absolute. See what your fear has wrought, little healer? Ronan sneered, sensing the shift in her, savoring her agony. You could have had a king. Instead, you get to watch him die. He lifted his sword for the final, killing strike. Lyra screamed, a raw, wordless sound of pure anguish. Jorek, with a final, desperate roar, managed to disarm one guard and lunge for his alpha, but he was too late. Ronan's blade plunged downward. It didn't strike the heart. It was a vicious, gutting wound to the abdomen, a mortal blow designed not for a quick death, but for a final, agonizing one. The deed done, Ronan shoved Lyra aside and beat a hasty retreat as the rest of the enraged pack warriors swarmed the tent. But the damage was done. Lyra scrambled to Kael's side, the world dissolving into a blur of red and a roaring in her ears. His blood was on her hands, on the furs, a testament to her failure. Chapter 18. The Last Beat of a Heart. The sounds of the fight, the roars of Kael's enraged warriors pursuing Ronan, all faded into a distant, meaningless hum. Lyra's universe had shrunk to the dying man in her arms. She pressed her hands to the horrific new wound, a futile attempt to hold his life inside him, but the blood flowed freely, hot and slick over her trembling fingers. He was fading, his life unraveling with a speed that stole the breath from her lungs. This was it. The end. There was no coming back from this. No healer in the world could mend a wound this catastrophic. Then, his eyes opened. They were no longer cloudy with fever or pain. They were clear, lucid, and fixed on her face. He saw her. In that final, fleeting moment of clarity, he truly saw her, and the depth of love and sorrow in his gaze was a thing that would haunt her for the rest of her days. There was no blame, no anger, only a profound, heartbreaking regret for what could have been. He lifted a hand, his movements slow and weak, and touched her cheek. His fingers were cold, but the touch was the gentlest thing she had ever known. "Mate," he whispered, his voice a faint, breathy sigh. The word she had feared, the claim she had rejected, was now his last gift, his final truth. It was a quiet, devastating absolution. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek and fell onto his. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. He took one last shuddering breath. And then, he was still. The light went out of his golden eyes. His hand fell from her face. The immense weight of his body settled into a final, horrifying stillness in her arms. He was gone. And in the exact same instant, the mate bond, that screaming, vibrant thread that had connected their souls, didn't just weaken. It snapped. The sensation was a physical agony beyond all description. It felt as if a vital part of her own soul had been violently ripped out, leaving a gaping, bleeding void in its place. A silent scream tore through her, a sound of such utter desolation that the warriors who had returned to the tent froze, their own grief forgotten in the face of hers. She held his lifeless body, rocking back and forth, completely hollow, empty. This was the bottom of the world. Her rejection, her fear, her choices. They had all led to this. The Alpha had died in her arms. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in the echoing silence of the void inside her. Jorik eventually approached, his face a mask of grief, and gently tried to pull her away. "He is gone, Lyra." But as he spoke, something impossible happened. Deep within the emptiness inside her, where the bond used to be, she felt a flicker. It wasn't a heartbeat. It wasn't life. It was a violent, convulsive pulse, a phantom kick against the walls of the void like a memory with teeth. It was an echo of his spirit, a spark of his soul, refusing to fade completely. It was still there. Somehow, impossibly, a piece of him was still tethered to the broken remnants of their bond. His soul wasn't gone, not completely. And that impossible, illogical spark changed everything. Chapter 19. An Echo in the Void. The pulse came again, a frantic, desperate kick against the nothingness inside her. It wasn't life. It was the memory of life, an echo refusing to fade. Yorik's hands were on her shoulders, his voice a gentle rumble, trying to pull her away from Kael's body. "He is gone, Lyra. There is nothing more you can do." But he was wrong. She could feel it. That impossible flicker was Kael. A piece of his soul, snagged on the broken edges of their bond, refusing to be dragged into the final silence. She pushed Jorik's hands away, her gaze turning inward, focusing on that tiny, struggling spark. Her mind, the healer's mind, began to race, tumbling through ancient lore she'd dismissed as myth. Ronan's words came back to her. The bond will leech the life from the mate. It was a two-sided connection, a conduit. Everyone knew the legends of alphas claiming their mates, a bite on the neck that sealed the bond and made it permanent. It was always an act of possession, of an alpha marking his territory. But what if the legends were incomplete? What if a claim wasn't just about power, but about the flow of life itself? The bond was a street that ran both ways. If his life could flow out, could her life flow in? A new, terrifying, and radical idea took root in her mind. What if she claimed him? An Omega claiming an Alpha? It was unheard of, unnatural, an absolute violation of every werewolf law and tradition. But her world was already in ashes. What did tradition matter now? The warning from Ronan was still a cold whisper in her ear. Completing the bond could kill her. The curse could turn on her, devour her instead. The fear was immense, a cold, heavy weight. But then she looked down at Kael's still face, at the noble lines of a man who had been her secret protector, who had vowed to earn her even as he was dying. The fear of her own death suddenly seemed small, insignificant compared to the vast, empty desolation of a world without him in it. In that moment, she made her choice. She chose love over fear. She chose a terrifying, uncertain chance over the absolute certainty of her grief. A fierce, wild determination surged through her, a fire that burned away the last of her hesitation. This was her fight now. "Yorik," she said, her voice low and steady, imbued with a strange, new authority that made the big warrior pause. "His soul isn't gone. I can feel him. I think I can bring him back." The beta stared at her, his expression a mixture of pity and disbelief. He thought she was mad, lost in her sorrow. "Lyra, that's not possible." "The bond is not a law of nature," she insisted, her voice rising with a passion that stunned them both. "It is a conduit of will. His will is gone. Mine is not." She stood up, her movements fluid and sure. She was no longer the trembling, uncertain Omega from the forest. The fire of her decision had forged her into something new, something harder. Keep everyone away from this tent. Guard his body. I have to finish this. Yorick looked into her eyes and saw not madness, but a terrifying, unshakable resolve. He saw a female who was about to go to war, not just with their enemies, but with fate itself. He slowly, hesitantly, nodded. Lyra gave Kael's peaceful face one last look, a silent promise passing between their spirits. Then she turned and strode out of the tent, her heart a steady drum of purpose. She was no longer just a healer. She was about to prove she was the equal of any alpha. Chapter 20. A Vow of Fangs. Lyra emerged from the tent into the chaotic aftermath of the battle. The air was thick with the scent of blood and the low sounds of grieving warriors. But she had no time for grief. Her purpose was a sharp, clear note in the cacophony of sorrow. Ronan and his guards had been driven off, but she knew he wouldn't have gone far. A predator like him would linger to savor his victory. She walked to the center of the clearing, her small form a stark contrast to the hulking warriors around her, and she lifted her head. "Ronan?" Her voice, clear and strong, rang through the pass, a shocking challenge. "You came here to kill an alpha. Are you coward enough to hide from an Omega?" A ripple of shock went through Kael's pack. Yorick moved to stand with her, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "This is my fight." After a moment of tense silence, a cruel laugh echoed from the rocks above. Ronan appeared on a ledge, his bloody sword in hand. "The little healer has a death wish," he sneered, dropping lightly into the clearing. "I was going to let you live with your misery, but if you insist on dying, I'm happy to oblige." He clearly expected her to charge him, to fight with the blind fury of a grieving mate. But Lyra didn't move. As he approached, she focused her mind inward, on the tiny, flickering spark of Kael's soul. She gathered all of her love, all of her rage at the injustice of his fate, all of her newfound will, and pushed it down the broken conduit of their bond. "Fight, Kael," she thought, her entire being focused on the message. "I am here. I am not leaving you. Fight with me." Ronan, impatient, finally lunged. Lyra moved. She didn't have his strength or his size, but she had a healer's intimate knowledge of the body. She was quicker, more agile. She ducked under his wild swing, her knife flashing out to slash the tendons behind his knee. He roared in pain and surprise, his leg buckling. He swung again, and she danced back, her movements fluid and desperate. She wasn't trying to win. She was trying to survive, to prove something, to make a sacrifice of her own pain and effort. With every blow she dodged, with every shallow cut she managed to inflict, she poured more of herself into the bond. It was a battle on two fronts. In the physical world, she fought a brutal alpha. In the spiritual one, she was breathing life back into a dying ember. She took a heavy blow from his backhand that sent her sprawling, the taste of blood filling her mouth. As she lay on the ground, his shadow falling over her, she felt a surge of energy through the bond. A response, a flicker of his strength meeting hers. Inside the tent, Yorick, who had been watching the body, saw Kael's finger twitch. Then again. A weak, thready pulse began to beat in his throat. Lyra scrambled back to her feet, a wild, triumphant grin on her bloodied face. He was there. He was fighting. Renewed, she faced Ronan again, no longer just a healer, no longer a victim. Every move she made was a declaration. I am not broken. I am not weak. I am his equal. She was no longer just defending herself. She was fighting for them both, and that knowledge gave her a strength she had never known she possessed. She saw her opening, a moment when Ronan was off balance from his injured leg, and she knew her chance had come. Chapter 21. The Omega's Claim. With a final, desperate burst of speed, Lyra didn't press her attack on Ronan. Instead, she did the last thing he expected. She dodged under his sword arm and sprinted, not away, but directly back towards the tent where Kael's body lay. The move was so bizarre, so contrary to the logic of a fight, that it left Ronan and all the watching warriors momentarily stunned. It was the only opening she needed. She burst through the tent flap, her gaze immediately finding the alpha on the furs. His eyes were open, just a slit, but they were open, and they were focused on her. His heart was beating, a faint, unsteady rhythm, a fragile bird fluttering in his chest. It wasn't enough. He was still dying. "Yorick, hold the entrance," she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that left no room for argument. She dropped to her knees beside Kael, her hands framing his face. His skin was still cold, but there was a flicker of life in his gaze now, a spark of his true self recognizing her. The bond between them was a thin, trembling thread, a pathway she had forced open with her will. Now she had to make it a permanent bridge. Leaning down, she pressed her forehead to his, her voice a fierce, possessive whisper that was for him alone. "You vowed you would earn me, Kael, but there is no more time, so I will earn you." She drew back, her eyes blazing into his. "You are mine." Then, in a stunning reversal of all tradition, a defiant scream against the laws of their kind, she leaned down and sank her teeth into the side of his neck, right over the prominent ridge where an alpha was supposed to mark his mate. The act was a cataclysm, a silent, blinding explosion of pure energy. The moment her teeth broke his skin, the fragile thread of their bond ignited into a raging golden river of light that only they could see. Her life force, her love, her unshakable will poured into him in a torrential, healing flood. Simultaneously, the bloodvine curse, dormant in his fading body, sensed this new, vibrant source of life. It surged through the bond, a tide of black, corrupting energy, seeking to devour her as Ronan had promised. But it slammed into the purity of her claim. Her bite was not an act of possession. It was an act of absolute, selfless sacrifice. It was love in its most primal, untainted form. The darkness of the curse could not comprehend it. It hit the golden light of her love and shattered, disintegrating into nothingness. A wave of power exploded from them, a visible ripple in the air that sent the tent flaps whipping wildly. Kael's eyes flew wide open, no longer hazy, but blazing with their full, brilliant gold. He gasped, a deep, shuddering intake of air that was his first true breath of life. The mortal wound in his abdomen, the gash that should have killed him, sealed itself with impossible speed, leaving behind only smooth, unblemished skin. The black veins of the poison vanished from his body as if they were never there. He sat up, his movements fluid and powerful, his gaze locked on Lyra. He was healed, whole. He was more than healed. He was reborn. He reached up, his fingers gently tracing the fresh bite mark on his neck with a look of utter reverence. The power of their completed bond hummed between them, a deep, resonant chord of two souls forged into one. He looked at Lyra, who was pale and swaying from the effort, but very much alive, and a slow, wondering smile spread across his face. Together, they rose to their feet, turning to face the entrance of the tent. No longer a dying alpha and a broken omega. They were a single, united force, and their war was just beginning. Chapter 22. Two Halves of a Whole. They emerged from the tent together, moving as one. The dim light of the clearing seemed to brighten, drawn to the impossible power radiating from them. Kael stood tall and whole, the last traces of the curse burned away, leaving behind a raw, primal vitality. Beside him, Lyra was no longer a shadow. She was a flame, her spirit intertwined with his, her gaze clear and unafraid. The pack warriors stared, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. Before them stood not just their resurrected alpha, but something new, a partnership forged in death and defiance. Ronan, who had been savoring his victory, stumbled back, his face a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. Impossible! he stammered, his bravado crumbling into dust. "You were dead. The curse. The Omega." He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't articulate the reality that was staring him in the face. Kael took a step forward, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the very ground. "You built your power on curses and fear, Ronan. You know nothing of the real strength a bond can hold." He didn't draw his blades. He didn't need to. The sheer force of his presence was a weapon in itself. Enraged and cornered, Ronan let out a guttural roar and charged, a wild, desperate lunge. The fight that followed was nothing like the brutal struggles before. It was a dance. Kael met his charge, but he was no longer fighting alone. Through the humming, vibrant conduit of their bond, he could feel Lyra. She was his second set of eyes, his anchor, his strength. His left flank is open. The thought was hers, but it bloomed in his mind as his own. He spun, his elbow catching Ronan in the jaw, a move he wouldn't have anticipated a second sooner. Lyra didn't hide. She moved along the edges of the fight, her healer's eyes identifying weaknesses, her movements a constant, distracting threat. Ronan, maddened by this inexplicable, coordinated defense, turned his attention on her. "I'll kill you, witch!" he bellowed, swinging his sword in a wide, clumsy arc. But Kael was already there, his body intercepting the blow. He didn't even use his blades. He caught Ronan's sword arm, the sound of snapping bone echoing through the clearing. Ronan screamed, a high, thin sound of agony. Kael was no longer just a warrior. He was an alpha defending his mate, and his power was absolute. He looked at the whimpering, broken wolf at his feet, his golden eyes filled not with rage, but with a cold, final judgment. "My mate saved my life," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the pass. "And in doing so, she has condemned you." With a final, decisive movement, he ended the threat of Ronan for good. The war was over. Silence descended upon the clearing, broken only by the panting breaths of the warriors. They all stared, not at their defeated enemy, but at the Alpha and the Omega, who now stood side by side, two halves of a single, unbreakable whole. Chapter 23. The Weight of a Soul. The moment the last echo of battle faded, the immense, supernatural energy that had sustained Kael began to waver. The adrenaline vanished, leaving behind a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. A shudder racked his frame. The strength that had poured from him in a torrential flood was gone, the cost of his miraculous resurrection, and the final, violent confrontation finally coming due. His knees buckled. The world tilted, the edges of his vision going dark as his body, having endured death and rebirth in the space of a single day, finally threatened to give out. He was falling, a dead weight of muscle and bone, expecting to hit the hard, unforgiving ground. But he didn't. Lyra was there, catching him before he could fall. She wrapped her arms around him, her small frame surprisingly strong, and held him up. It was a perfect, poignant reversal of the moment she had dragged his broken body into her clinic. Now, he was the one collapsing, and she was the one refusing to let him go, her strength becoming his anchor. She eased him down to the ground, cradling him against her as his head slumped against her shoulder. His breath was ragged, his body trembling with the aftershocks of the power that had flowed through him. The great Alpha Kael was, in this moment, utterly vulnerable, and completely hers. "Lyra," he murmured, his voice thick with exhaustion. He turned his head, his lips brushing against the soft skin of her neck, right below the faint, fading mark of his own claim from a lifetime ago. "I thought I'd lost you." All the walls, all the fears were gone now, burned away in the fire of their ordeal. All that remained was the quiet, undeniable truth of their connection. "You did," she whispered, her own voice trembling as she stroked his hair. "And I thought I'd lost you." She leaned back slightly, her hand cupping his cheek so he would look at her. His golden eyes were soft, filled with a love so profound it stole her breath. "I love you," he breathed, the words a raw, simple confession. I think I have since the moment I saw you through that window. You were a fire in the middle of all that darkness. Tears she hadn't realized she'd been holding back finally fell, tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. I was so afraid, she confessed, her voice cracking. I let what he did to me, what I thought you were, almost destroy us. She leaned in, pressing a soft, trembling kiss to his lips. I love you, Kael. I think my soul knew it from the very beginning, even when my heart was too broken to listen. He let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief, and seemed to melt into her, his immense strength finally surrendering to her care. Yorick and the other warriors watched from a respectful distance, their faces full of awe. They were witnessing not just the end of a war, but the birth of a new legend, a Luna who had pulled their alpha back from the void, and an alpha who was not afraid to find his strength in her embrace. The conflict was over, the confessions were made, and in the quiet aftermath of the battle, they held each other, their two souls finally at peace. Chapter 24. The Luna's Dawn. When the first snows of the season began to fall, they dusted the peaks of a new home. Kael had led his pack to a hidden, fertile valley, a place to heal and rebuild, far from the blood-soaked memories of their war with Ronan. In the center of the valley, a great hall was being raised, its fresh-cut timber smelling of pine and promise. But the true heart of the pack was no longer just the alpha. It was the alpha and his Luna. Lyra was not a queen who sat on a decorative throne. She was a force, a presence that moved through the pack with a quiet, confident grace that had completely remade their world. She stood now on a balcony overlooking the valley, the crisp winter air gentle on her face. Her past as a broken, rejected Omega felt like a story about someone else, a ghost from a different life. That ghost had given her scars, but she now knew those scars were not a source of shame. They were a source of empathy. She was the healer who understood what it was to be broken, the leader who knew the cost of being an outcast. She sat on Kael's council, her calm, measured perspective a perfect balance to his warrior's instincts. They were not just mates, they were partners, equals. A revolutionary concept that was slowly reshaping the future of their pack. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and Kael's familiar warmth enveloped her. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his gaze following hers out over the peaceful valley below. The humming connection of their bond was a constant, comforting presence, a deep, resonant music beneath the surface of the world. He was whole, strong, the curse a forgotten nightmare. Her claim, the faint, silvery scar on his neck, was a mark he wore with more pride than any crown. "It's quiet," she whispered, leaning back into his embrace. "It's peace," he rumbled, his voice soft in her ear. "You gave us that." She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. She looked into his golden eyes, which now held only warmth and a deep, abiding love for her. A faint, teasing smile played on her lips. "You died in my arms once, you know," she murmured, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "I don't recommend it. The paperwork is a nightmare." He chuckled, a low, warm sound that vibrated through her. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "My soul knew what it was doing," he whispered, his voice full of a deep, unwavering sincerity. "It was just trying to find its way home." He captured her lips in a slow, tender kiss, a kiss that held no desperation, no fear, only the quiet certainty of a love that had been tested by death and had emerged unbreakable. She had once believed love was her greatest fear, the one thing that could truly destroy her. But as she stood here, wrapped in the arms of her mate, her alpha, her partner, she knew the truth. Love hadn't been her destruction. It had been her salvation.